All right, let's see if we can't get this thing working again. Tonight we're going to be reading Revelation chapter 12, and 2 weeks ago we read chapter 11. We're only going to go through about half of chapter 12 tonight because there's a lot of content and it's very long. And I want to recap what we did 2 weeks ago. And I apologize for the link switch. There was a microphone issue, but we got it figured out. So let's begin by recapping chapter 11. So in Revelation 11, it brought us into the heart of the tribulation timeline and really clarified God's continued dealings with Israel. The chapter opened with John being instructed to measure the temple, the altar, and those who worship there, showing us that, a literal rebuilt temple exists during this future period and that Jewish worship is taking place once again. At the same time, the outer court is left unmeasured and given over to the Gentiles, revealing a season of Jerusalem being trampled for 42 months. And this firmly placed us in the first half of the 7-year tribulation and reminded us that God is still sovereignly distinguishing what belongs to him, even in time of judgment. The chapter then introduced the two witnesses who prophesy for 1260 days, clothed in sackcloth. Their ministry was, one of warning. God protected them completely until their testimony was finished, granting them authority that mirrored other ministries, those of Moses and Elijah. When their work was complete, the beast was permitted to kill them, and the world responded with celebration, if we remember. And that really revealed to us how deeply truth had become just hated. And that celebration was short-lived. If we remember, God resurrected the witnesses in full view of the enemies and called them up to heaven, immediately followed by a great earthquake that brought fear and forced acknowledgement of God's authority. As the chapter closed, the seventh trumpet sounded, and heaven declared what earth had long resisted. The kingdoms of this world now belong to the Lord and his Christ. The 24 elders worshipped, affirming that God's reign had been decisively asserted. Judgment and reward were both set into motion, and the chapter ended with the heavenly temple opened and the Ark of the Covenant revealed, reminding us that everything unfolded is rooted in God's covenant, in his faithfulness. So Revelation 11 showed us that God always sends testimony before judgment, and truth is vindicated in the end. So now that we have that set up, laid out, remember that from 2 weeks ago, let's start reading chapter 12. And we'll read to about verse 9 and we'll finish it next week. All right. So, verse 1. Now a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a garland of 12 stars. Then, being with child, she cried out in labor and in pain to give birth. Another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great fiery red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 diadems on his heads. His tail drew a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth, and the dragon stood before the woman who was ready to give birth to devour her child as soon as it was born. She bore a male child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up to God and his throne. Then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she had a place prepared by God that they should feed her there 1,260 days. And the war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought with the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought, but they did not prevail, nor was a place found for them in heaven any longer. So the great dragon was cast out, that serpent of old called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was cast to the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. Whew. All right, so let's go back through and start unpacking what we read. In verse 1, now a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and her head a garland of 12 stars. This verse starts by telling us how we're supposed to read what follows. John calls it a great sign. A sign isn't something that's meaningless. It's something that God uses to point to real truth. And John says this sign appears in heaven, which is why a literal-minded approach naturally would ask, why would John be looking at when he looks up into heaven? The most obvious answer is the heavenly bodies, sun, moon, stars, because those are exactly the elements that this verse is using. That also fits the Bible's teaching that God placed lights in the sky for signs and seasons. Genesis 1:14. So from the start, scripture gives permission to treat this as a God-designed marker and not just, imagery. The woman is described with three very specific features. She's clothed with the sun, the moon under her feet, and a crown or garland of 12 stars on her head. So the detail here, I think, is very important. It's not, this woman that came to him in a dream. She's presented with a cosmic arrangement, which supports the idea that this sign can be seen in some way in the heavens. So now it's important to say this part carefully. The Bible condemns using the heavens for fortune telling, otherwise known as astrology, but it doesn't condemn observing what God made and recognizing his order, which is astronomy. Very two different things. In fact, God invites it. He says to lift up your eyes and consider the heavens as the work of his hands in Isaiah 40:25-26. And Psalm 19 teaches that the heavens declare and show knowledge in a way that reaches the whole earth. That doesn't replace scripture. It supports it by showing God's fingerprints in creation. So your next question may be, who is the woman? The best identification, especially with how the chapter will unfold, is Israel, not the church. But one of the strongest biblical anchors for this is Joseph's dream. He sees the sun, moon, and 11 stars bowing down, and Jacob interprets that as symbolic of the covenant family in Genesis 37:9-11. That connection is important because Revelation 12 uses the same kind of sun, moon, and stars language, and it fits Israel's identity far better than any other interpretation. And 12 stars also naturally point to the 12 tribes. And all this matters because the rest of the chapter shows this woman persecuted and fleeing and preserved in a way that lines up with Israel during the tribulation. And so there's another even bigger prophetic reason this verse really matters. It signals that Revelation is not only moving forward chronologically, but also zooms out at key points to give kind of like the background footage of the spiritual and covenant storyline. In other words, this verse is like God saying, before I show you the escalation of the tribulation, I'm going to remind you who the main earthly target is and why. And finally, this verse fits the broader biblical principle that signs are associated with Israel in a special way. Paul says Jews request a sign in 1 Corinthians 1:22. That doesn't mean Gentiles never see signs, but it doesn't mean that signs are especially meaningful in God's dealing with Israel. So when John introduces a great sign tied directly to the sun, the moon, and the stars, and then centers the whole chapter around Israel and Satan's hatred for her, it makes sense to read verse 1 as a deliberate marker. God is highlighting Israel's covenant role and preparing us for the spiritual war the chapter is about to unfold into. Verse 2. Then being with child, she cried out in labor and in pain to give birth. This builds directly on the identity that we were establishing in verse 1 for the woman. The woman who is identified as Israel is now described as being with child, and that tells us that this sign is tied to messianic expectation. Throughout Scripture, Israel is portrayed as the nation, though the Messiah would come. And that promise is repeatedly pictured using language of pregnancy and labor and birth. And this isn't new for us to read here. It's also deeply rooted in Old Testament. Isaiah speaks of Zion traveling and bringing forth children, and Isaiah 66 7-9. Micah describes Israel laboring until the ruler comes forth from Bethlehem in Micah 5:2-3. And Jeremiah uses birth pangs as to describe Israel's distress before deliverance in Jeremiah 36-7. So when John says the woman is crying out in labor, he is tapping into this long-established biblical theme. And that phrase, she cried out in labor and pain, is important because it reflects both historical reality and prophetic pattern. Historically, Israel's path to the Messiah was marked by suffering, bondage in Egypt, exile, oppression under the foreign leaders at the time, and intense spiritual conflict. But prophetically, labor pains are also a picture Jesus himself used to describe the period leading up to the end in Matthew 24. Labor pains intensify before birth, they don't lessen, which fits the idea that, Israel's anguish is increasing as God's plan is moving closer to fulfillment. So, some great language for us. It's also very significant that the verse doesn't name the child. The restraint creates anticipation and forces us to keep moving forward. And John's just setting the stage before revealing the identity of the child in later verses. At the same time, the language strongly points back to Christ's first coming. Israel's longing for deliverance, her groaning under oppression, and the expectation of a promised ruler all converge here. And Romans 9:4-5 reinforces this by stating plainly that Christ came from Israel according to the flesh. So, verse 2 anchors the sign in real redemptive history and not abstract symbolism. Going into verse 3, and another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great fiery red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 diadems on his heads. So now incoming the second sign, and the language here is also very clear that this is separate and distinct from the first one that we just read about. John is very intentional. Just as the woman was a sign, this is also a sign, meaning it represents a real spiritual entity and real power structures, and not something made up. The word another signals that shift in the focus. So a vision now moves from God's redemptive purpose to the adversary who opposes it. Scripture consistently reveals that whenever God is bringing something into the world, Satan is already positioned to resist that. The identity of the great red dragon is not left to our minds or speculation, because later in the chapter, John explicitly identifies him as the serpent of old called the devil and Satan, but we will get there. So this isn't a new figure to us. This is Satan's symbolic and authoritative form as he operates behind the earthly systems. And the color red is, of course, significant. Red is repeatedly associated with bloodshed and violence and destruction in Scripture. Jesus describes Satan as a murderer from the beginning in John 8:44, and the red dragon imagery emphasizes his role as a destroyer who thrives on this kind of chaos. The dragon's 7 heads, 10 thorns, and 7 crowns point beyond Satan alone to the political and governmental power structures that he energizes. In biblical symbolism, horns represent power and authority. We read that back in Daniel 7:7-8, and crowns represent ruling dominion. The numbers here match what will later be described in Revelation 13 and 17 regarding the final Gentile world empire and the Antichrist kingdom. This shows that Satan does not operate alone. He works through organized systems. He is influencing kings and empires and governments to just blatantly oppose God's plan. It's important to notice that this sign here in this verse also appears in heaven. That doesn't mean that Satan rules heaven, but it emphasizes that this conflict is spiritual before it is earthly. Paul tells us that our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers in heavenly places in Ephesians 6:12. Revelation 12 is pulling back the curtain to show what has always been true, Earthly persecution and global conflict are downstream effects of spiritual war that is already going on. And my last point on this verse is that there is an intentional contrast between these two signs. The woman is clothed with light, the sun, the moon, and the stars, which is, all commonly tied to God's order and covenant. And the dragon, by contrast, is monstrous and crowned with stolen authority and very violent. One represents God's redemptive plan, and the other represents rebellion and a false rule. It's really preparing us for the central tension of the chapter, Satan's hatred for Israel and his obsession with stopping God's promises at the source. Let's keep on moving. His tail, verse 4, drew a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was ready to give birth to devour her child as soon as it was born. So we're pulling back the curtain even further here, to show the depth of Satan's rebellion and the intensity of his opposition to God's redemptive plan. The first image here, the dragon's tail drawing a third of the stars of heaven, points to a past event with ongoing consequences. In scripture, stars are often used to symbolize angels, and we read back in Job 38:7 and Revelation 1:20. And this aligns with the biblical teaching that a large number of angels fell with Satan in his original rebellion. And the language doesn't suggest an astronomical event, but more like a spiritual fall, where Satan successfully drew many angels into his revolt against God. And they're fallen now. They're demons who continue to operate under his authority. And the fact that this happens through the dragon's tail is also very meaningful. A tail implies deception rather than, direct confrontation. Satan didn't overthrow heaven by force. He deceived, he persuaded, he finagled. That fits perfectly with how he's described as subtle and deceptive, manipulative from the beginning in Genesis 3:1 and John 8:44. His rebellion is not very loud and open at first. It's cunning and corruptive, and the result is very catastrophic. So then this verse shifts from Satan's ancient fall to his focused hatred of the Messiah. John says the dragon stood before the woman, poised and waiting, ready to destroy the child the moment that he was born. And this compresses centuries of history into one picture. Satan has always sought to prevent the promised seed from arriving. We see this pattern repeatedly. Pharaoh ordering Hebrew baby boys killed in Exodus 1. Athaliah attempting to wipe out the royal line of David in 2 Kings, and Herod slaughtering the children of Bethlehem in an attempt to kill Jesus in Matthew 2. And each of these moments reflect the same impulse to stop the promised deliverer before he can fulfill God's plan, which can never happen. But this verse makes it clear that Satan understood exactly who the child was, what he would do. Very strategic. The dragon doesn't chase the child after birth. He waits for the arrival. And that detail alone shows the desperation. Satan knew that once the Messiah came and completed his mission, his ultimate defeat was guaranteed. So verse 4 highlights the urgency of Satan's resistance and explains why the conflict surrounding Christ's coming was very fierce. Verse 5. She bore a male child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up to God and his throne. So we kind of look at verse 5 like a centerpiece of the chapter because it reveals the identity of the child and explains why Satan's opposition is so fierce. Sorry. The phrase male child is deliberate and specific. John isn't describing a a group here. He's pointing to a singular promised ruler. The description that follows removes all doubt. This child is the one who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron. That language comes directly from Psalm 2, 7, and 9, a messianic passage universally recognized as referring to Christ. Revelation later applies this same phrase to Jesus explicitly, Revelation 19:15, so the child in this verse is unmistakably Jesus Christ. The rod of iron speaks to Christ's future reign, not his first coming. At his first coming, Jesus came in humility. At his second coming, he will rule with authority and righteousness. This verse compresses Christ's entire redemptive mission into one sentence, from birth to kingship. Revelation often does this, skipping over long periods of time to highlight outcomes rather than process. The cross, resurrection, ascension, and future reign are all implied without being spelled out individually here. The next phrase, her child was caught up to God and his throne, is especially important. This isn't describing the rapture of the church, even though the language sounds pretty similar. Context is key, especially when we're going through this. Jesus was caught up. When he ascended after his resurrection, Acts 1:9 and Hebrews 1:3 tells us he is now seated at the right hand of God. Revelation is emphasizing the victory of Christ and not the suffering of Christ. Satan wanted to devour the child, but instead of destroying him, the child completes his mission and is exalted to the highest place. What Satan tried to stop becomes the very means of his defeat. And that said, there is a deliberate parallel being drawn. The same verb idea of being caught up will later apply to believers. Jesus is the first fruits, and those who belong to him will follow. 1 Corinthians 15:20-23. So while this verse is about Christ historically, it also subtly points forward to the pattern of resurrection and ascension and will apply to his people. Revelation frequently layers truth this way, one meaning primary and other secondary, but still intentional. I don't know what that question means, but I am a Christian woman, if that's what you're asking. Verse 6. Then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days. So now there is a clear shift in the timing and the focus. Up until this point, the chapter has moved quickly from Israel's identity to the birth of Christ to his ascension. So now the narrative jumps forward into the future tribulation period, specifically the last half of Daniel's 70th week. Revelation often does this, compressing centuries into a few verses and then slowing down when it reaches the events of the end. The phrase, then the woman fled, signals that the spotlight is no longer on Christ's first coming, but on Israel's experience during the tribulation. The woman, still talking about Israel here, flees into the wilderness, which immediately is echoing Old Testament patterns. God has always dealt with Israel in wilderness settings during times of testing and preservation. Israel was formed as a nation in the wilderness after Exodus, protected and sustained directly by God. Hosea even describes a future moment when God will again draw Israel into the wilderness to speak to her heart. And that's Hosea 2:14. So this is covenant language that we're reading here, that the wilderness is a place of separation and protection and our dependence on God. John is careful to tell us that this place is prepared by God. Israel isn't fleeing, a panic flee. They're not doing that. It's a divine provision for them. God prepared the ark for Noah before judgment came, and God prepared Goshen for Israel during the plagues of Egypt. He like those times, has already prepared a place for Israel before the worst period of judgment comes to unfold. This reinforces the truth that the tribulation, though severe, is not inherently chaos, it's controlled judgment under God's sovereignty. The length of time Israel is protected is stated with precision, just as we've been reading all these very specific, precise times in Revelation to this point, 1260 days. Scripture consistently uses this number. We've read it a couple times, along with 42 months and times and half a time to describe 3.5 years. And we've seen this in Daniel 7:25, Daniel 12:7, Revelation 11:2-3. It's prophetic timing. This period corresponds to the second half of the tribulation after the Antichrist breaks his covenant with Israel, desecrates the temple, and declares himself God. And that can be read in Daniel 9:27 and Matthew 24:15. At that moment, Israel must flee, and just as Jesus warned, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. The phrase that they should feed her there emphasizes God's sustaining care. Just as Israel was fed with manna in the wilderness, God will again provide what is needed for survival. This isn't just spiritual nourishment alone. There is a sense of physical preservation going on. This is a time when the world is under judgment and Satan's wrath is completely unleashed. Going into Verse 7, and war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought with the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought. So we're really revealing the spiritual conflict that runs parallel to the events of the tribulation on earth. John tells us plainly that war breaks out in heaven. This is a very real spiritual battle taking place, something that we can't see, but scripture repeatedly teaches that what happens on earth is deeply connected to the battles that are happening in the spiritual realm. The leader on God's side is Michael, named specifically and intentionally. Michael is not an ordinary angel. He is consistently presented in scripture as the archangel assigned to Israel. Daniel 10:21 calls him your prince when speaking to Daniel about Israel, and Daniel 12:1 says Michael will stand up for Israel during the time of great trouble. Language that clearly aligns with the tribulation. Jude 9 also shows Michael contending directly with Satan, reinforcing that this is not their first confrontation. So this chapter brings that long-standing conflict to its turning point. Michael doesn't fight alone. We read Michael and his angels. They stand against the dragon and his angels. The fallen angels are now openly engaged in warfare, no longer just influencing from behind the scenes. This is a transition from Satan's limited access to heaven as an accuser from Job 1 and Zechariah 3 to a moment where that access is challenged directly. And the fact that this war occurs in heaven is very crucial. Up until this point in history, Satan has had access to heaven in some capacity, where he accuses God's people day and night. Revelation 12 reveals that this access is going to end. This battle it is God's perfect timing, and as the tribulation reaches its midpoint, heaven itself is being cleansed of Satan's presence, just as earth is moving toward its final confrontation. So we're really setting the stage for a shift that is coming. So let's close out with these last two verses. Verse 8, but they did not prevail, nor was a place found for them in heaven any longer. Satan loses completely and permanently. The phrase they did not prevail is short but very weighty. Despite Satan's power and influence, he is unable to stand against God's authority. This verse reinforces a crucial biblical truth that Satan is powerful, but he isn't sovereign. His rebellion has limits, and those limits are set by God. The next phrase is even more powerful, nor was a place found for them in heaven any longer. Until this moment, Satan and his angels have had some form of access, like I said before, particularly in the role of accuser. We see this clearly in Job 1 to 2, where Satan presents himself before God, and in Zechariah 3, where he stands to accuse the high priest. Revelation 12 reveals that this access is finally and decisively revoked. Heaven is no longer a place where Satan can enter, accuse, or operate in any capacity. And this is not temporary. This is a very permanent eviction. The wording leaves no room for return, and from this point going forward, Satan's sphere of operation is restricted to the earth, and later to the abyss, and ultimately the lake of fire. This explains why the intensity of evil on earth escalates dramatically in the second half of the tribulation, because Satan no longer has the ability to divide his efforts between heaven and earth. So his focus is becoming singular. It's become very desperate, and it's going to become very violent. All right. Verse 9, and we'll close out here for tonight. So the great dragon was cast out, the serpent of old, called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was cast to the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. Verse 9 leaves absolutely no ambiguity about the identity of the dragon. John piles up names and titles to make sure the reader understands exactly who this is. He's a great dragon, emphasizing power and terror. The serpent of old, tying him directly back to Genesis 3 and the deception of Eve. The devil meaning slanderer or accuser, and Satan is the adversary. Every name highlights a different aspect of his character and activity, showing that the same enemy who opposed God at the beginning is still at work in the end. John also identifies Satan's primary method of deception. He's the one who deceives the whole world. Very important because it explains how Satan has been able to influence nations and religions and governments throughout history without openly revealing himself. He doesn't rule primarily by force, but by lies. Jesus himself said that Satan is the father of lies and that there is no truth in him in John 8:44. Revelation 12 confirms that global deception is not accidental and it is satanic in its origin. The phrase "was cast out" is repeated for emphasis. He's not retreating. He's being very forcibly removed by God's divine authority. And the repetition underscores the finality and violence of this expulsion. Heaven is no longer a battlefield, and Satan's defeat there is complete. And the statement that his angels were cast out with him also confirms that these fallen angels are fully aligned with Satan and share in his judgment. There's no neutrality in the conflict. When Satan falls, his entire rebellious host falls with him. This mass expulsion explains the surge of demonic activity that Scripture describes in the latter half of the tribulation. And evil will not gradually increase. It intensifies suddenly and very sharply. This verse also marks a dramatic shift in Satan's strategy. Once confined to earth, he knows that his time is short. He can no longer accuse believers in heaven, so he redirects his rage towards those still on earth, and particularly Israel. The rest of the chapter shows that this casting down triggers intense persecution and global chaos and what looks like political upheaval on earth. And that in reality is the fallout of a spiritual defeat in heaven. But we will continue that next week. So I hope that everybody reads ahead so we can study the rest of this chapter in depth next week. And happy Thursday. Hope you all have a great weekend, and I will see you next Thursday. Good night.